The mother of the computer hacker Gary McKinnon has told 5 Live of her sheer joy at the decision by the Home Secretary, Theresa May, not to send him to the US to face trial.
The reaction was he couldn't speak. Tears flowed and he just couldn't speak. And afterwards, another point, he went out, he walked in, we hugged, he cried again, and it's almost as though you're scared to believe it's real because the emotion is massive, it really is.
Gary McKinnon, who has Asperger's syndrome, was spared extradition on the grounds that he was seriously ill and there was a real risk of him attempting suicide if he was sent to the US. But following the move, the government has faced several accusations of double standards and blatant racism by Muslim groups. Last month, the Home Secretary approved the extradition of Saeed Talha Ahsan, who also suffers from Asperger's syndrome. His brother Hamja told 5 Live his family have been going through hell since he was sent to the US.
I'm delighted for Gary McKinnon's family, and I'm someone who campaigned for Gary McKinnon. I wasn't just campaigning for my brother. So I'm very happy for her, and I'm very happy for her because Gary McKinnon and his family don't have to go through the nightmare and horror that my family have been going through the past week. My brother's in solitary confinement in an American prison. I haven't even heard from him, not a single phone call. I'm terrified.
Here's what the Respect MP George Galloway has had to say.
It will be taken by Muslims and many others in Britain as one law for the white guy and another law for the black guys. And whether that's true or not, that's how it looks.
Well, Dr. Leon Mousavi is a sociologist of race and religion, specialising in Muslim communities in Britain. Yesterday he tweeted, "Call me sceptical, but I've got a feeling that if Gary McKinnon was a non-white Muslim, he'd be on the first plane to a US Supermax jail." Good morning.
Good morning.
We're also going to speak to, and I know the two of you don't want to get into a row, so I'll speak to you one by one, Julian Knowles QC, who's a leading practitioner on extradition and human rights law. Julian Knowles, good morning to you.
Good morning. Dr.
Leon Mousavi, many people say you've got a point here, but we can also point to Christopher Tappin, extradited, and the bankers, Giles Darby and David Birmingham and Gary Mulgrew as well. So you can say that if you're a middle-class white businessman, you're also discriminated against. So aren't you being a little bit selective?
Well, I think what we need to be aware of is the wider war on terror that's been waged by America over the last 10 years. And to me, this is another example of Britain's complicity in that war on terror, where they're willing to send British citizens to American supermax prisons where the human rights status is very questionable, whereas it seems very strange to me that only 10 days later, another example which seems very similar to some of those who were sent previously, is that person is not sent over. And I think that we need to have, if there is a genuine difference between them, we need to have a clear explanation as to why there is a difference between these two cases when it seems like there's so much in common.
Might it be then, of the two people who are suffering from condition, have that condition, or Asperger's, or on the autistic spectrum, Mr. Hassan being one and Mr. McKinnon being another, might the difference be, as some people would say, that Mr. McKinnon was looking for UFOs and Mr. Hassan was encouraging jihad and people to be murdered?
Well, my understanding of the ruling was that there was concern for his human rights and there was concern that he might commit suicide. I don't see why these concerns wouldn't also apply to Muslim citizens. And the fact is, like George Galloway mentioned in that clip, regardless of whether this is correct or not, what I'm saying, a great deal of people, especially Muslims, but not just Muslims, a lot of other people who are concerned with human rights do believe, and people have been saying this for years, that since 9/11 and since the war on terror, the human rights of Muslims have been undermined. If you want to talk about Guantanamo Bay, if you want to talk about extraordinary rendition, if you want to talk about the torture that Britain has been part of, which has been led by a US war on terror, this is very concerning for British citizens, and I think we must speak up against that and not be part of this US war on terror, which involves this plucking of citizens.
Did you support the extradition of Abu Hamza? We spoke to, on this programme, a very moving interview with somebody who was out in the Yemen and saw his wife, they were held hostage, saw his wife murdered. And Abu Hamza is accused of complicity in that. It's very serious crimes.
It definitely is.
So you support his extradition, do you?
I mean, obviously, we all condemn this type of terrorist activity, and if someone is accused of it, they should be charged and they should be trialed, and this is the basis of the justice system that most of us believe in. And it's quite shocking when we remember that Baba Ahmed, for example, was held in prison without charge in the UK for 8 years. This is unprecedented and it's very scary, and a lot of Muslims in the UK now feel very vulnerable when they see this type of behaviour by the British government, where they detain people without charge for so long, and then eventually when the US calls them over, they send them over. And so what is there to stop other British Muslims from feeling secure as equal British citizens when the government is behaving in a way where their human rights are not being considered?
I'll get a response in a minute. Julian Mills, QC, what do you say to these arguments?
Well, I'm somewhat mystified about the suggestion that human rights weren't considered. Let's go back to the beginning and talk about Baba Ahmed's case. His case was considered by the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled that it wouldn't violate his human rights to extradite him to the US. Now, that decision may be right, may be wrong, and we can debate it, but it's the decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which is the body which has ultimate responsibility for determining human rights issues. And so when Baba Ahmed came to court a couple of weeks ago, he was in a weak position, as I think I explained then, because he had to somehow show something new, and he was unable to do that. So the idea that he was extradited because he was a Muslim and the British government doesn't take his human rights seriously is just wrong as a matter of fact. It was the European Court of Human Rights, rightly or wrongly, but it was the European Court that determined his extradition wouldn't violate his human rights. Gary McKinnon's case is a very different case factually. He was not extradited because of very high risk of suicide, which wasn't present. It wasn't a risk that was present in the other cases. And so to say somehow that there's unequal treatment of similar cases just isn't right, because they're not similar cases. They're factually very, very different.
Mr. Ahsan, who has Asperger's syndrome?
Gary McKinnon was not extradited simply because he had Asperger's syndrome. It was the Asperger's syndrome giving rise to a very high risk of suicide, a feature which was not present in the other cases.
Back to you, Dr. Leon Mousavi. You didn't quite address the issue of the NatWest 3 or of Christopher Tappin, high-profile white stockbroker types who were extradited.
Yeah, I see what your point is there. I mean, if I use another example, airport stops and searches, just because some non-Muslims or some white people
what's this
might
got
be
to
stopped
do with
and searched.
Sorry, what's this got to do with extradition?
If you let me finish, you'll see what it's got to do with. It's a really good example. Just because some non-white Muslims, white or non-Muslim people might be stopped and searched at airports, it doesn't mean that there isn't a disproportionate focus on Muslims who are passing through airports and being treated with suspicion. And similarly, if we're talking about extradition, just because we can highlight some examples of non-Muslims or white people who have been extradited, it doesn't mean that there isn't a disproportionate extradition process being targeted towards Muslim citizens.
Julian Knowles, is there a disproportionate extradition process being targeted towards Muslims?
Well, no, I don't believe there is, and I I'm a lawyer, my mind's always open to evidence. If anybody wants to present empirical evidence showing that that's the case, then obviously, that's something that I would look at and many of my colleagues would look at. But it's a very, very serious charge to say this must be racist because, look, he was extradited, he was a Muslim, he wasn't extradited, he was white. For that level of very serious accusation, there has to be very cogent evidence, and there just isn't.
Do you think the Daily Mail would have had the kind of campaign for Mr. Ahsan, for example, that they have had for a Muslim who was in the situation who'd been hacking into US computers, let's put it like that, than they had for Mr. McKinnon? Well,
I think you have actually made a valid point there, and I would say this. I think Gary McKinnon was fortunate and skillful. He was skillful in that he fought a very successful PR campaign. The fact that it's always reported he was looking for UFOs, if you actually look at the evidence, he wasn't. He left taunting messages on US computers, and it's hardly a surprise that the US reacted in the way that they did. So he was skillful, but he was also fortunate in terms of time.
What sort of taunting messages? Give us an example.
No, he left messages along the lines of your computer security is very poor, no wonder 9/11 happened, and direct challenges to the US establishment, and caused about £500,000 worth of damage to their computers because they had to be replaced and reprogrammed, etc. So he was skillful on as far as that's concerned, but he was also fortunate in that because of the timing of his case, it straddled an election campaign, and it so happened that extradition became an election issue, the perceived imbalance in the treaty, and Gary McKinnon was in the right place at the right time to have his case taken up as an example, in a way that Mr. Tappin was unfortunate. For example, Gary McKinnon was fortunate that his case was taken up, and you're right, that was aided by a favourable media, but it was a favourable media that was persuaded, if not manipulated, by a skillful PR campaign.
Thank you both very much indeed. It's really